When a power-hungry HOA Karen tries to stop an ambulance rushing to save a life, she has no idea the patient inside is the town's chief of police, and she's about to learn the hard way that messing with the wrong family comes with consequences. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the gated community of Willow Creek Estates, the kind of day where nothing ever seemed to happen. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow over the perfectly manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks. Chief Linda Martinez, the town's beloved chief of police, was enjoying a rare day off. She had spent the morning tending to her garden, her hands buried in the soil, her mind free from the usual chaos of her job. But by early afternoon, everything changed. Linda had just finished lunch when she felt it, a sharp stabbing pain in her chest that radiated down her left arm. She tried to brush it off, chalking it up to indigestion, or maybe a pulled muscle from gardening, but the pain only intensified, and soon she was struggling to breathe. Her daughter Mia was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when she heard her mother gasp. She looked up to see Linda clutching her chest, her face pale and slick with sweat. "Mom!" Mia screamed, dropping her phone and rushing to her side. "What's wrong?" Linda tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She slumped against the kitchen counter, her legs giving out beneath her. Mia's heart raced as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands trembling so badly she could barely press the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice asked. "My mom. She's having a heart attack, I think. We're at 42 Willow Creek Lane. Please, hurry." Mia's voice cracked as she fought back tears. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. Mia knelt beside her mother, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. "Stay with me, Mom. Please, just stay with me." Within minutes, the distant wail of a siren cut through the quiet afternoon. The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the Martinez house, and two paramedics rushed inside with a stretcher. They worked quickly, assessing Linda's condition and loading her into the back of the ambulance. Mia climbed in beside her, clutching her mother's hand as the vehicle sped off toward the hospital. But as the ambulance approached the community's exit, it was forced to slow down. A woman in a bright pink tracksuit stepped into the road, waving her arms like a deranged traffic cop. It was Karen, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, and she wasn't about to let anyone break the community's no speeding rule, not even an ambulance. The driver leaned out the window, his voice urgent. "Ma'am, this is an emergency. We have a critical patient." Karen crossed her arms, her face set in a stubborn frown. "Rules are rules," she said, her tone dripping with self-righteousness. "You're going 15 over the limit, and I'm not letting you through until you promise to follow the HOA guidelines." Inside the ambulance, Mia's fear turned to rage. She leaned out the back window, her voice shaking with anger. "Do you know who's in here?" she shouted. "Move out of the way." Karen rolled her eyes, unfazed. "I don't care if it's the mayor. Rules apply to everyone." The paramedics exchanged worried glances. Every second counted, and Karen's stubbornness was putting Linda's life at risk. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Karen stepped aside, muttering something about respecting the community. The ambulance sped off, but the damage had been done. Precious minutes had been lost, and Mia could only pray they wouldn't be the difference between life and death. The ambulance's tires screeched as it came to an abrupt halt, the force of the stop causing Mia to lurch forward in her seat. She gripped her mother's hand tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the small window at the back of the ambulance, she could see the woman in the pink tracksuit standing in the middle of the road, her arms crossed, and her face set in a mask of stubborn determination. Karen, the HOA enforcer, was blocking their path, and she wasn't moving. The driver, a paramedic named Jake, leaned out the window, his voice strained but polite. "Ma'am, please, we have a critical patient in here. This is a life-or-death situation. We need to get to the hospital now." Karen didn't budge. She tilted her head, her lips pursed in disapproval. "I don't care what's going on in there. You're speeding through our community, and that's against the rules. The HOA has strict guidelines, and I'm not about to let you flout them just because you have flashing lights." Jake's patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am, this is an ambulance. We're responding to an emergency. Please, step aside." Karen took a step closer to the vehicle, her hands on her hips. "Do you know how many times I've heard that excuse? Everyone thinks they're above the rules. Well, not in my neighborhood. You're going 15 miles over the speed limit, and I'm not letting you through until you acknowledge that, and promise to follow the guidelines. Inside the ambulance, Mia's fear was rapidly turning to fury. She could hear the exchange, and every word out of Karen's mouth made her blood boil. She leaned out the back window, her voice sharp and trembling with anger. "Do you have any idea who's in here?" she shouted. "This is Chief Linda Martinez, the chief of police. She's having a heart attack, and you're standing here arguing about speed limits. Move out of the way." Karen's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked even more smug. "I don't care if it's the mayor in there," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Rules are rules, and they apply to everyone. If I let you through, what kind of example does that set for the rest of the community?" Mia's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to leap out of the ambulance and shake some sense into the woman, but she couldn't leave her mother's side. Linda's breathing was shallow, her face pale and clammy. Every second counted, and Karen was wasting precious time. Jake tried one last time, his voice firm but pleading. "Mum, I'm begging you. Step aside. If anything happens to our patient, because of this delay, you could be held legally responsible." For a moment, it seemed like Karen might finally relent. She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the back of the ambulance, but then her jaw tightened, and she shook her head. "I'm not moving until you acknowledge that you were speeding, and promise to follow the rules next time." The paramedics exchanged a look of disbelief. Jake muttered something under his breath, and reached for the radio. "Dispatch, we're being delayed at the Willow Creek Estates exit. A resident is blocking our path. We need assistance ASAP." Mia's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at her mother. "Hold on, Mom," she whispered. "Just hold on." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Karen stepped aside, muttering something about respecting the community. The ambulance surged forward, its siren wailing as it sped toward the hospital, but the damage had been done. Precious minutes had been lost, and Mia could only pray that they wouldn't be the difference between life and death. The ambulance finally arrived at the hospital, its tires screeching as it pulled up to the emergency entrance. The paramedics rushed Linda Martinez inside on a stretcher, her face pale and her breathing labored. Mia followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. She could barely think straight, her mind a whirlwind of fear and anger. The delay caused by Karen had cost them precious minutes, and Mia couldn't shake the feeling that those minutes might have made all the difference. As the doctors took over, Mia was ushered into the waiting room. She collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone. She needed to call her dad, but first, she needed to vent. She opened her social media app, and began typing furiously, her fingers flying across the screen. She didn't care about being polite anymore. Karen had put her mother's life at risk, and the world needed to know. "Just had the most infuriating experience of my life," she wrote. "My mom, Chief Linda Martinez, had a heart attack, and while we were rushing to the hospital, some HOA Karen blocked our ambulance because we were speeding. She literally stood in the road, and refused to move, even after we told her it was an emergency. My mom could have died because of her. This is beyond unacceptable." Mia hit post and leaned back in her chair, her chest heaving. She didn't expect what happened next. Within minutes, her post started blowing up. Comments poured in, people expressing their outrage, and sharing their own stories of run-ins with power-hungry HOA members. Someone tagged the local news station, and before long, Mia's phone was buzzing with notifications. Reporters were reaching out, asking for interviews. The story was spreading like wildfire. Meanwhile, Karen was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. She had returned to her HOA meeting, where she proudly recounted the incident to the other board members. "I stood my ground," she said, her voice filled with self-righteous pride. "I told them, rules are rules, and they apply to everyone. If we let one person break them, where does it end?" The other board members nodded along, though a few looked uneasy. One of them, a man named Greg, cleared his throat. "Karen, are you sure that was the right call? I mean, it was an ambulance. What if someone was really hurt?" Karen waved a hand dismissively. "Oh please. They always say it's an emergency. It's just an excuse to break the rules. Besides, I made my point. They won't be speeding through here again. But Karen's smugness was short-lived. By the next morning, the story had exploded. The local news ran a segment on it, complete with footage of Karen standing in front of the ambulance, her arms crossed defiantly. The anchor's voice was stern as she recounted the incident, emphasizing the potential consequences of Karen's actions. Social media was ablaze with outrage, and the hashtag #HOA Karen was trending. Karen's phone started ringing off the hook. Friends, neighbors, and even complete strangers were calling to demand an explanation. Her inbox was flooded with angry messages, and her social media profiles were inundated with comments calling her out for her behavior. She tried to defend herself, posting a lengthy rant about the importance of rules and community standards, but it only made things worse. People weren't buying it. By the end of the day, Karen's life was in shambles. She was shunned by her neighbors, her HOA position was in jeopardy, and she had become the town's most infamous resident. Meanwhile, Mia sat by her mother's bedside, holding her hand and praying for her recovery. The fight wasn't over, but Mia knew one thing for sure: Karen was going to pay for what she had done. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Chief Linda Martinez was propped up in bed, her face still pale, but her eyes sharp and alert. She had survived the surgery, but the ordeal had left her weak and exhausted. Mia sat by her side, recounting everything that had happened. The ambulance, Karen's obstruction, the social media storm, and the media frenzy. Linda listened intently, her jaw tightening as Mia described Karen's refusal to move. She actually stood in front of the ambulance. Linda asked, her voice low but laced with anger. "Even after you told her who was inside?" Mia nodded, her hands clenched into fists. "She didn't care, Mom. She kept saying rules are rules like it was some kind of mantra. I've never been so furious in my life." Linda closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was a steely resolve in her gaze. "This isn't just about me," she said. "What if it had been someone else? Someone who didn't have the resources, or the platform to fight back. This can't happen again." The next day, Linda was discharged from the hospital, against her doctor's advice. She wasn't one to sit still, especially when there was work to be done. She called an emergency town meeting, inviting residents, local officials, and of course the HOA board. The community center was packed, the air thick with tension. Everyone had heard about the incident, and opinions were divided. Some supported Karen, insisting that rules were necessary to maintain order. But most were outraged, demanding accountability. Karen arrived late, her head held high, as if she were walking into a victory parade. She took a seat at the front of the room, oblivious to the glares and whispered comments. When Linda stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. She looked out at the crowd, her expression calm but commanding. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady. "As many of you know, I recently experienced a medical emergency. Thanks to the quick actions of my daughter and the paramedics, I'm still here, but what happened that day was unacceptable. While I was fighting for my life, one of our own residents chose to block an ambulance because it was speeding. Let me be clear, this was not just an inconvenience, this was a matter of life and death." The room erupted in murmurs, but Linda held up a hand for silence. "I'm not here to shame anyone, I'm here to make sure this never happens again. Rules are important, but they should never come before common sense or human decency. What happened that day was a failure, not just of one person, but of our community as a whole." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her confidence wavering. Linda's gaze landed on her, and for the first time, Karen looked genuinely nervous. "Karen," Linda said, her tone icy, "your actions were reckless and selfish. You delayed an ambulance, carrying a police officer in critical condition. Your refusal to move could have cost me my life. Consider this, your official warning, and your resignation from the HOA board." The room erupted in applause, but Karen shot to her feet, her face red with anger. "You can't do this," she shouted. "I was just enforcing the rules. If you let this slide, it sets a dangerous precedent." Linda didn't flinch. "The only dangerous precedent here is putting rules above human life. You're done, Karen. Sit down."
Karen looked around the room, searching for support, but even her usual allies avoided her gaze. Defeated, she sank back into her chair, her face a mask of humiliation. Linda turned back to the crowd, her voice firm. Moving forward, we're implementing new guidelines to ensure that emergency vehicles are never delayed again. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. As the meeting adjourned, Karen slunk out of the room, her head down. Linda watched her go, her expression unreadable. The fight wasn't over, but for now, justice had been served. The days that followed the town meeting were a whirlwind of change, and for Karen, a slow unraveling of the life she had built. The story of her confrontation with the ambulance had spread far beyond Willow Creek Estates, becoming a cautionary tale of power gone wrong. News outlets picked it up, and Karen's face was plastered across headlines. HOA Karen blocks ambulance, doesn't realize, patient is chief of police. Social media was relentless, with memes and hashtags like #HO Karen and #rules, rules trending for days. Karen's once pristine reputation was in tatters. Neighbors who had once tolerated her bossy demeanor now avoided her like the plague. The grocery store became a minefield of whispered comments and sideways glances. Even her closest friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the woman who had become the town's most infamous resident. Karen tried to defend herself, posting long rambling explanations on social media about the importance of rules and community standards, but her words only fueled the fire. The backlash was swift and merciless. Meanwhile, Chief Linda Martinez was back at work, her presence a reassuring symbol of strength and resilience. She wasted no time implementing the new community guidelines she had promised. Emergency vehicles were now given absolute priority, with clear signage and protocols to ensure they were never delayed again. Linda also pushed for a review of the HOA's bylaws, advocating for more reasonable enforcement and greater accountability. The changes were met with widespread support, and Linda's approval rating soared. For Mia, the aftermath of the incident was a mix of relief and lingering anger. She was grateful her mother had survived, but the memory of Karen standing in front of the ambulance, arms crossed and unmoving, still haunted her. She found herself driving past Karen's house often, as if to remind herself that justice had been served. One afternoon, she noticed a bright yellow for sale sign planted firmly in Karen's front yard. Mia couldn't help but smile. It seemed Karen had finally realized she was no longer welcome in Willow Creek Estates. Karen's decision to sell her home wasn't just about the backlash. It was about survival. The constant scrutiny had become unbearable, and the financial strain of legal fees. Linda had filed a formal complaint, and Karen was facing potential charges for obstructing an emergency vehicle, was mounting. Packing up her life felt like admitting defeat, but Karen had no other choice. As she boxed up her belongings, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had brought this on herself. Her obsession with rules and control had cost her everything. The day Karen moved out, the neighborhood felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. Kids played freely in the streets, and neighbors chatted without fear of being scolded for minor infractions. Linda and Mia watched from their porch as the moving truck pulled away, a sense of closure settling over them. "Do you think she'll ever realize how wrong she was?" Mia asked, her voice quiet. Linda sighed, her gaze thoughtful. "Maybe, but some people never learn. The important thing is that we've made sure this won't happen again. That's what matters." Mia nodded, leaning into her mother's side. "I'm just glad you're okay." Linda wrapped an arm around her daughter, pulling her close. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." As the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, the community began to heal. Karen's house sat empty, a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and selfishness. But for Linda and Mia, it was a symbol of something else, a victory for common sense, compassion, and the unbreakable bond of family. Sometimes, karma doesn't just knock, it kicks the door down, and in Karen's case, it had done so with a vengeance.